The uneasy feeling. Charles Benson, CEO of Apex Tech Innovations, stood in his luxurious, glass-walled corner office, overlooking the expanse of the city skyline. His office was a pristine space of sleek, modern design, a reflection of the thriving empire he had built over the last decade. At 48, he was one of the most successful black CEOs in the tech industry, revered for his vision, leadership, and relentless drive. Apex Tech had grown from a modest startup to a multinational corporation, disrupting industries with cutting-edge technologies that powered everything from smart cities to personal health innovations. Yet today, as Charles gazed out at the bustling metropolis below, he was not basking in the usual pride that accompanied his achievements. Instead, an unsettling sense of unease gripped him. It had been months since the first cracks in Apex Tech's corporate armor began to show. Small, subtle, but unmistakable signs that something wasn't right beneath the polished exterior. His gut told him that his company's culture was faltering. The problem wasn't numbers. The company's financials were strong, and they had just closed another record-breaking quarter. It was the human element. The employee satisfaction surveys, usually a glowing reflection of Apex Tech's workplace, had begun to tell a different story. They painted a picture of a workforce that felt undervalued, overworked, and disconnected. His senior management assured him that the issues were minor, just the natural consequence of rapid growth. But Charles wasn't convinced. "Mr. Benson, your 10 a.m. is here," came the voice of his assistant through the intercom. "Send them in, Maria," Charles replied, still standing at the window. The door opened to reveal Emma Thompson, Apex Tech's head of human resources, and Darren Lewis, the COO, both of whom wore expressions far too serious for a typical morning meeting. Charles had called this meeting after the latest round of survey results had come in. What he hoped for was clarity, but what he feared was confirmation of his worst suspicions. "Thanks for coming," Charles said, moving toward the sleek conference table. "I want to get straight to the point. Something isn't right with our culture. The latest survey results are troubling, to say the least." Emma opened her tablet and cleared her throat, clearly nervous about presenting what she had uncovered. "Charles, as you know, we've seen a 20% drop in overall employee satisfaction compared to last year. The areas of greatest concern include work-life balance, communication, and most significantly, a loss of trust in senior management." Charles nodded, but his mind was already racing. How had things deteriorated so quickly? He had always prided himself on fostering an open, innovative, and inclusive environment. He thought his employees were engaged and motivated, but now it seemed like the core values he had built the company on were slipping away. Worse, he hadn't seen it coming. "What are the employees saying in the open-ended feedback?" Charles asked, already bracing for the worst. Emma hesitated for a moment, glancing at Darren before continuing. "Some of the comments are candid, to say the least. There are mentions of favoritism, managers who are unapproachable, and a lack of recognition for hard work. Several employees mentioned feeling like they're just a number in the system." Darren leaned forward, his expression trying to be reassuring. "Charles, I think we need to remember that we've grown rapidly over the past 2 years. There are bound to be growing pains. We've nearly doubled our workforce, opened 3 new international offices, and launched 2 new product lines. It's a lot for anyone to handle." Charles waved a hand dismissively. "I'm not interested in excuses, Darren. I want solutions. We're only as strong as the people we rely on. And right now, they don't feel supported. What do we do?" Emma cleared her throat again, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "We could look at boosting engagement through some new initiatives, maybe additional benefits, or we could schedule more team-building activities." "No," Charles shook his head. "Those are just Band-Aid solutions. We need to get to the root of the problem. I want to know what's really going on here, not just what people are willing to say in an anonymous survey." The room fell silent for a moment, and then Charles leaned back in his chair, an idea slowly forming in his mind. I'm going to see for myself. Darren frowned. What do you mean? I've spent the last few years disconnected from the ground level, Charles explained. I make decisions from up here in this office, but I've lost touch with what it's really like for the people who make this company run. If I want to understand what's wrong, I need to experience it firsthand. Emma's eyes widened slightly. Charles, are you saying? I'm going undercover, Charles said, the resolve clear in his voice. I'll spend a few weeks working at different levels of the company, but not as the CEO. I'll pose as a janitor, someone invisible enough to observe everything without being noticed. Both Darren and Emma exchanged nervous glances. That's unprecedented, Darren said slowly. It's risky, too. What if someone recognizes you? I'll take that risk, Charles replied. This company is my responsibility. If there's a cultural issue, it's my job to fix it. Emma leaned forward, clearly concerned. But Charles, how will you manage the company while you're away from your usual role? I'll still be in touch, of course, Charles reassured her. But this is too important to delegate. I need to see with my own eyes what's really going on at Apex Tech. There was a long pause before Darren finally nodded. If anyone can pull it off, it's you. Just be careful. Charles smiled, though the weight of the decision hung heavy on his shoulders. I will. I just hope what I find isn't worse than what I've already imagined. Over the next few days, Charles quietly worked with Maria and Emma to put his plan into action. He would step away from the CEO role temporarily, and his public explanation was that he was taking time to focus on strategy and long-term planning. But in reality, Charles Benson, the powerful CEO, was about to become Charles Mitchell, the newest janitor at Apex Tech headquarters. His journey into the heart of his own company was about to begin. As Charles prepared for his transformation into a janitor, he found himself feeling something he hadn't in years: anxiety. The decision he was making was unconventional and risky, but he knew it was the only way to truly understand what was happening. He would have no assistants, no power suits, and no title to hide behind. For the first time in over a decade, he would be just another worker, blending into the background while observing the reality of life at his company. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he was determined to face whatever truth awaited him. The disguise of humility. Charles Benson stood in front of the mirror, staring at a version of himself he barely recognized. Gone was the tailored suit, the silk tie, the polished shoes that had become his uniform of power and success. In their place, he wore a pair of well-worn khakis, a faded blue work shirt, and scuffed sneakers. A janitor's uniform. His thick, neatly groomed beard was trimmed down to stubble, his usual expensive cologne replaced by the faint scent of industrial soap. He hardly looked like the man who had negotiated billion-dollar deals or delivered keynote speeches to thousands of tech innovators. Today, he was Charles Mitchell, the newest janitor at Apex Tech headquarters, blending into the sea of workers that maintained the pristine image of the corporate giant. "Ready, sir?" Maria, his assistant, asked from the doorway. She had been the only person besides Emma who knew the full extent of his plan. "As ready as I'll ever be," Charles said, glancing at his reflection one last time. His eyes still had that sharp, analytical look, but there was a nervousness there, too. For years, he had led from the top, with the respect of thousands of employees. Today, he would lead from the shadows, invisible to the very people who depended on him. Maria handed him a plain ID badge with the name Charles Mitchell printed under the Apex Tech logo. "We've set up your backstory. You're a temp hire, filling in while we restructure the janitorial staff. No one should ask too many questions." Charles nodded, pinning the badge to his shirt. "Perfect. The less attention I draw, the better." He took a deep breath and left the office, his office, for what would be the last time in weeks. As he stepped out into the hallway, he found himself hyper-aware of the stares of those around him. He wondered if anyone would recognize him, despite his new appearance. But to his surprise, no one did. People passed him by with barely a glance, just another face in the crowd. Already, he was beginning to experience the anonymity he had sought. ***. The day began at 6 a.m., hours before most of Apex Tech's staff would even arrive. Charles had never been in the building this early before. The usually bustling hallways were quiet, save for the distant hum of cleaning equipment and the low murmur of the janitorial staff gathering for their morning briefing. Charles walked into the back room, where the custodians met each day before starting their rounds. The room was small and utilitarian, a stark contrast to the lavish meeting spaces upstairs. Inside, a group of about 10 janitors stood around sipping coffee, exchanging small talk before their supervisor arrived. Most of them were older, their faces lined with years of hard work, their uniforms as worn as his own. A few younger workers leaned against the walls, checking their phones. No one seemed to notice Charles as he quietly took a seat in the back, until a large, heavy-set man in his late 40s entered the room. He wore a stained baseball cap and had a clipboard in hand, his demeanor that of someone who had long ago accepted the grind of daily labor. "All right, listen up," the man said, his voice a low growl. "I'm Carl, your supervisor. If you're new, pay attention. You mess up, you hear about it from me. If you're late, you hear about it from me. You slack off. Well, you get the idea." Charles nodded, blending in as Carl rattled off the day's assignments. It struck him how different the tone was down here compared to the corporate briefings he was used to. There were no motivational speeches, no talk of innovation or teamwork. It was simply about getting the job done. "Mitchell, right?" Carl barked, looking straight at Charles. "Yes, sir," Charles replied, instinctively respectful. "You're with Terrence today. He'll show you the ropes." "Terrence," Carl called out, and a tall, lanky man in his early 30s waved a hand lazily from across the room. "Got it, boss," Terrence said with a smirk, looking Charles up and down with mild amusement. "Come on, newbie. Let's get this show on the road." Terrence led Charles out of the break room and into the labyrinth of hallways that made up the lower floors of the building. As they walked, Terrence gave Charles the lowdown on their duties for the day, cleaning the executive offices, restocking supplies, and making sure the floors were spotless before the upper management arrived. It was a simple enough job, but as they worked, Charles quickly realized that it wasn't the tasks themselves that would provide insight, it was the people around him. ***. Terrence was a talker. He complained about the job, the pay, and the management within the first 5 minutes of their shift. "Man, you're lucky you're just here temping," Terrence said, dragging a mop across the hallway floor. "This place will suck the life out of you if you stick around too long." Charles nodded, listening carefully. "How long you been here?" "Too damn long," Terrence muttered. 4 years now. Started off thinking I'd move up, maybe get into maintenance or something. But nah, they keep us where we are. If you're not part of the fancy crowd upstairs, they don't care about you." Charles noted the bitterness in Terrence's voice. It wasn't the first time he heard complaints about limited upward mobility in the company, but hearing it firsthand from someone who lived it was different. Terrence went on about the long hours, the lack of recognition, and the favoritism that seemed to dictate who got promoted and who didn't. "You ever see those execs?" Terrence asked, glancing toward the upper floors as if they were a distant kingdom. "They don't even look at us. Walk right by like we're invisible." Charles stayed quiet, feeling a strange sense of irony. He was one of those execs, one of the people Terrence and the others resented. But as he scrubbed floors and emptied trash cans, he realized just how true those words were. In all his years at Apex Tech, he had never stopped to think about the people who kept the place running behind the scenes. They were invisible to him too. As the day wore on, Charles found himself watching not just the janitors, but everyone else in the building. The office workers barely acknowledged the janitorial staff, their eyes sliding past them without a second thought. A few offered polite nods, but most acted as though the custodians were part of the furniture. It was an unsettling realization, one that began to confirm Charles' worst fears. By the end of the day, Charles was exhausted in a way he hadn't been in years. His muscles ached from the manual labor, and his mind was buzzing with everything he had observed. He had expected to see some distance between management and lower-level employees, but the sheer scale of the disconnect shocked him. There was a whole world inside ApexTech that he had never truly seen before, a world of invisible workers, each with their own frustrations, fears, and dreams. As he mopped the floors outside the executive suites that evening, Charles overheard a conversation between two mid-level managers walking by. They were discussing the latest round of layoffs, joking about how it would trim the fat and boost the bottom line. There was no empathy in their voices, no understanding of the impact those decisions would have on the lives of the people they were discussing. Charles gripped the handle of the mop, feeling a surge of anger. These were his employees, his people, and yet the culture that had developed under his leadership was one of cold indifference. He had created a company that valued profits over people, and now he was seeing the human cost of that decision. For the first time in years, Charles didn't feel like a successful CEO. He felt like a failure. That night, as Charles lay in his small temporary apartment, he couldn't stop thinking about the faces of the janitors, the office workers, and the managers. The divide between them was vast, much bigger than he had ever imagined. He had always believed that ApexTech was a family, a place where everyone could thrive. But now, it was clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Charles wasn't sure what he would find when he went undercover, but what he had discovered so far was worse than he had expected. It wasn't just a few disgruntled employees or minor communication issues. There was a systemic problem, one that went to the very heart of the company's culture. And as he prepared for another day as Charles Mitchell, he knew that his journey was far from over. Tomorrow, he would dig deeper, talk to more people, and try to understand the full extent of the damage. But one thing was already clear. ApexTech wasn't the company he thought it was, and fixing it was going to take more than just a few policy changes. It was going to take a complete transformation, starting with him. Beneath the surface. The next day, Charles Benson, now fully immersed in his identity as Charles Mitchell, arrived at ApexTech even earlier than before. The early morning quiet of the building felt familiar now, though there was still something surreal about navigating its halls as an unseen, unnoticed figure. He had spent years walking these same corridors with the reverence and respect his position demanded. But as a janitor, he was practically invisible. As he pushed his cleaning cart through the dimly lit hallways, Charles found himself reflecting on the conversations from the day before. Terrence's bitterness echoed in his mind, as did the cold indifference of the managers he overheard. Charles had built ApexTech with the vision of a company that could change the world, not just through its innovative technologies, but through the way it treated its people. Yet, somewhere along the line, that vision had been lost. His company had grown into a machine, and the people inside it had become cogs, moving silently in their roles with little recognition or reward. Today, Charles was determined to dig deeper. He had already gotten a sense of the disconnect between the upper and lower tiers of the company, but he wanted to understand the nuances, the personal stories behind the statistics and survey comments. He wanted to know what it was like to be a worker at ApexTech, where the pressures and frustrations went unnoticed by the boardroom. He needed to see how far the disillusionment had spread. Asterisk. Charles' first assignment for the day was cleaning the third-floor offices, an area primarily occupied by mid-level managers and teams working on the company's latest projects. The space was bustling by the time he arrived, with employees already deep into their work. Unlike the executive suites on the top floor, the third floor had an air of urgency and pressure. Workers moved quickly between desks, phones ringing constantly, laptops open, and conversations flying across the room about deadlines, client demands, and project milestones. Charles noticed the strained expressions on many of the employees' faces, and as he quietly went about his work, he began to listen. "I can't keep up with this workload. A young woman near the window whispered to a colleague, "I've been working 12-hour days, and it's still not enough. They just keep piling more on." Her colleague, a man in his early 30s, nodded sympathetically. "Same here. And then when something slips through the cracks, they act like it's our fault. Management doesn't care how stretched thin we are. As long as the numbers look good, that's all that matters." Charles pushed his cart past them, pretending not to hear, though his heart sank. These were the people who powered ApexTech's innovations, the ones who kept the wheels turning. Yet here they were, exhausted and disillusioned, feeling like expendable parts of a much larger machine. As he made his way down the hall, he overheard more conversations, each one reflecting the similar sense of burnout and frustration. "They told us we get bonuses if we hit our targets, but now they're saying the budget's too tight. What was the point of working ourselves to death? It's all about who you know. I've been here for 5 years, and still no promotion, but Sarah got bumped up after 2 just because she's in tight with the VP. The culture here has changed so much. It used to be collaborative, but now it's cutthroat. Everyone's competing just to keep their jobs." Charles couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility. These were not the kind of conversations he'd ever imagined taking place in the halls of his company. ApexTech had prided itself on being an inclusive, forward-thinking workplace, but now it seemed more like a corporate battlefield, where employees were fighting to survive rather than thrive. Asterisk asterisk. Around midday, Charles was assigned to work with Jenny, a janitor who had been with ApexTech for nearly 8 years. Jenny was in her mid-50s, with a calm, no-nonsense demeanor that came from years of hard work. She was small in stature, but moved with the efficiency of someone who knew every corner of the building by heart. "So, you're the new guy, huh?" Jenny said with a wry smile as they met in the break room to grab supplies. "Welcome to the glamorous life of cleaning up after people who don't know your name." Charles chuckled, though the weight of her words hit him. "Yeah, I'm getting the hang of it. How long have you been here?" "Long enough to know how things really work around here," Jenny replied. "I've seen CEOs come and go. They all have big ideas, but it's the same story every time. The people who do the real work don't get noticed. We're just here to keep the place running, and they forget about us until something goes wrong." Charles nodded, pushing the conversation deeper. "So, you've seen a lot of changes then. What's it like working here now?" Jenny let out a dry laugh. "Well, it used to be better. When I first started, this place felt like a family. There were company picnics, appreciation days, even small bonuses for the janitorial staff during the holidays. But that stopped years ago. Now it's just about the bottom line. Everyone's replaceable. You can feel it in the air." As they worked, Jenny shared more about her experience. She talked about how the higher-ups rarely acknowledged the cleaning staff unless there was an issue, how raises were infrequent and barely enough to keep up with the cost of living, and how the workload had increased over the years without any additional support. "You'd think with all the money this company makes, they'd take better care of the people who keep it clean and running," Jenny said as they emptied trash bins in one of the conference rooms. "But no, it's always about cutting costs, trimming fat. We're just another expense to them." Charles felt a wave of guilt wash over him. As CEO, he had been part of the cost-cutting decisions, always pushing for efficiency and higher profits. He had approved budgets that affected the very people he was now working alongside, without fully understanding the impact those decisions had on their lives. "You ever think about leaving?" Charles asked. Jenny shrugged. "Where would I go? I'm too old to start over somewhere new, and I need the benefits. It's not easy, but I've got a family to take care of. So I keep my head down and do my job." Her words stayed with him as they moved through the building. Jenny wasn't alone. There were dozens of employees just like her, trapped in jobs that barely acknowledged their contributions, staying out of necessity rather than passion. It was a stark contrast to the vibrant, innovative culture Charles had once envisioned for ApexTech. Asterisk asterisk. Later that afternoon, Charles found himself in the heart of the building's innovation wing, where the tech teams worked on the company's most groundbreaking projects. This was the area he had been most proud of when he first started Apex Tech, a hub of creativity and collaboration. But as he moved through the space, cleaning desks and refilling coffee stations, he noticed that something had shifted here too. The energy was tense, almost anxious. The employees huddled in small groups, their conversations quiet but intense. One group, in particular, caught his attention. They were working on Apex Tech's new AI-driven healthcare platform, a project that had garnered a lot of attention in the media for its potential to revolutionize patient care. But instead of excitement, the team looked worn down. "This deadline is impossible," one of the engineers muttered. "We're nowhere near ready for launch. But they keep pushing us. It's like they don't care about the quality anymore, just the timeline." Another team member sighed. "Yeah, and if it fails, we're the ones who'll get blamed, not the execs. They'll just say we didn't deliver." Charles felt a pang of recognition. He had been that executive, pushing for faster turnarounds, demanding results without fully considering the strain it put on his teams. He had believed that pressure would drive innovation. But now, seeing the exhaustion on their faces, he realized it had done the opposite. It had drained them. Asterisk. By the time his shift ended, Charles felt emotionally and physically drained. He had spent the day listening, observing, and absorbing the reality of life at Apex Tech from a perspective he had never seen before. What struck him most was the sense of disillusionment that permeated every level of the company. It wasn't just the janitorial staff or the mid-level employees, it was everyone. Even the teams working on the company's flagship projects were feeling the pressure, the disconnect, and the lack of support. As he left the building that evening, Charles walked through the crowded downtown streets, his thoughts swirling. He had come undercover to understand what was wrong with his company. And now he knew. The problem wasn't a single issue. It was systemic. The culture had eroded from the inside out, and it had happened on his watch. For years, Charles had focused on growth, on pushing Apex Tech to be the best in the industry. But in doing so, he had lost sight of the people who made that success possible. He had created a company that valued innovation and profit above all else, and now it was crumbling from within. He couldn't fix everything overnight. He knew that. But as he made his way back to his temporary apartment, one thing was clear: change was coming. And it had to start with him. "You said, continue with part 4 more unique and lengthy." ChatGPT said. ChatGPT. Part 4. The breaking point. As the days wore on, Charles' journey as Charles Mitchell took him deeper into the heart of Apex Tech's workforce. Each day peeled back another layer of the company's inner workings, exposing truths that were both heartbreaking and eye-opening. He had heard the frustration from the tech teams, the exhaustion from the janitorial staff, and the cold indifference of middle management. But what he hadn't yet encountered was the tipping point, the moment when employees decided they had had enough. Charles began to notice a strange tension building in the office. Conversations behind closed doors grew more frequent, and there was a palpable sense of unease in the air. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something was brewing. He decided to focus his attention on the operations department, a group responsible for keeping the company's day-to-day logistics running smoothly. It was a critical function, but one that rarely got the spotlight or the praise. It was here that he would finally discover just how deep the cracks in Apex Tech's foundation ran. Asterisk. It started with a small comment. Charles was wiping down a counter in the break room when he overheard 2 employees discussing the company's upcoming quarterly meeting. "I heard they're cutting bonuses this quarter," one of them said, her voice low and bitter. "Of course they are," the other replied, laughing humorlessly. "They're rolling out this new AI platform, and you know all the budget is going toward that. We're just an afterthought." Charles' ears perked up. Bonuses were a key component of the company's incentive structure, especially for departments like operations, where the work was often tedious and unglamorous. He knew the AI project had ballooned in costs, but cutting bonuses wasn't something that had crossed his desk. Had the decision been made without his knowledge? Or worse, was someone else pulling the strings in ways that hurt the employees? His curiosity piqued. Charles decided to stick closer to the operations team over the next few days. He shadowed them as they managed the flow of product shipments, handled customer service escalations, and coordinated the logistical nightmare of scaling a rapidly growing company. What he saw was a department stretched to its limits, with employees balancing impossible workloads while still finding time to help one another. Yet, despite the teamwork he witnessed, the morale in operations was dangerously low. People worked long hours, but there was no recognition, no reward. Management rarely interacted with them except to push for faster results. Charles noticed a particular employee named Carl, a middle-aged man who had been with the company for over a decade, quietly shouldering much of the department's workload. Carl was respected by his peers, but there was a noticeable weariness in his eyes. One afternoon, Charles found himself working alongside Carl in the storage room. The older man was cataloging inventory with the efficiency of someone who had done the same task 1,000 times before. "Hey, Carl," Charles said, trying to strike up a conversation. "You've been here a while, haven't you?" Carl didn't look up from his clipboard. "Yeah, 12 years. 12 years is a long time. You must have seen a lot of changes around here." Carl sighed and finally set the clipboard down, wiping his hands on his jeans. "More than I care to remember. This place used to be different, better. Now it's all about the bottom line. They don't care about the people anymore." Charles nodded, leaning against the wall. "You ever think about leaving?" Carl let out a hollow laugh. "Every day. But I've got a family. Kids in school, a mortgage. You know how it is. It's not like there are a ton of jobs out there for a guy my age." Charles had heard this story too many times now. Employees trapped, not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. It was a stark reminder of how disconnected he had become from the reality of the people who worked for him. He had built a company that offered cutting-edge products to the world, but internally, it seemed to be failing the very people who powered that success. The conversation with Carl stuck with Charles as he moved through the rest of his day. But it wasn't until later, when he overheard a hushed conversation between two managers, that he began to realize the gravity of the situation. Asterisk, asterisk. That evening, after most of the office had emptied out, Charles was cleaning one of the smaller conference rooms when he noticed two managers, Steve and Lorraine, sitting in a corner, speaking in low voices. He hadn't interacted much with Steve and Lorraine, but he knew their reputations. Steve was a hardliner, known for pushing his team to their breaking point in the name of efficiency, while Lorraine had built a reputation as a no-nonsense leader with little patience for what she called excuses. "They're going to riot if this goes through," Steve was saying, his voice barely above a whisper. "What choice do we have?" Lorraine replied, her tone clipped. "The board is pushing for cuts, and we can't touch the tech teams. They're the ones driving revenue." Steve shook his head. "Operations is already overworked. If we cut bonuses and freeze promotions, they'll lose it." "We don't have a choice," Lorraine snapped. "The AI launch is bleeding money, and if we don't hit the next quarter's targets, it's not just bonuses on the line, it's jobs." Charles felt a chill run down his spine. The AI project again. It was becoming clear that this flagship initiative, meant to drive Apex Tech into the future, was coming at a steep cost to the rest of the company. But what Steve and Lorraine were discussing wasn't just a matter of tightening belts. It sounded like the company was on the verge of making drastic cuts that would push an already strained workforce over the edge. As he continued his work, Charles couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. The employees he had been talking to over the past few weeks, Carl, Terrence, Jenny, were already at their breaking point. If their bonuses were cut, if promotions were frozen, it wouldn't just be bad for morale. It could lead to something much worse. Asterisk, asterisk. The next day, Charles found the operations floor even more tense than usual. Conversations were quieter. and people moved with a nervous energy that suggested something was about to happen. He couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that seemed to ripple through the department. By lunchtime, he heard whispers of a meeting being called, an unofficial gathering among the operations staff. Curious, Charles followed the group to a large break room on the lower level of the building. The room was packed with employees, some standing, others leaning against tables, their faces set in grim determination. Carl was there, standing near the front, and as Charles slipped into the back of the room, he saw Terence and several other janitorial staff members as well. At the front of the room, a woman Charles didn't recognize stood up and addressed the group. Her name tag identified her as Melissa, and from the way people were looking at her, it was clear she was someone they respected. "We all know what's coming," Melissa began, her voice steady but filled with frustration. "Management's cutting bonuses, promotions are on hold, and they're going to expect us to keep working like nothing's changed." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "We've been overworked and underappreciated for too long," Melissa continued, her voice rising. "They push us harder every year, and for what? So the execs can cash in while we're left with nothing." Charles felt a pang of guilt in his chest. This was exactly the kind of sentiment he had feared. He had known the company culture was fraying, but he hadn't realized just how close it was to unraveling completely. "What are we supposed to do?" Someone called from the back of the room. "They've got all the power. We're just cogs in the machine." Melissa shook her head. "We're not powerless. Not if we stand together. We need to send a message. Let them know we're not going to keep doing this unless they start treating us like we matter." Charles watched as the crowd nodded in agreement, their faces hardening with resolve. This wasn't just idle grumbling. This was the start of something more. A movement, a stand against a company that had pushed its employees too far. And as Charles stood there, a janitor among his own employees, he realized that this was his moment of reckoning. He had come undercover to understand what was wrong with his company. And now he knew. The question was, what would he do about it? Asterisk, asterisk. The meeting ended with a plan. The employees would stage a coordinated work slowdown, refusing to meet the impossible demands being placed on them. It wasn't a full-blown strike. At least, not yet. But it was a warning. A message to management that the workers weren't going to keep sacrificing their health, their time, and their well-being for a company that didn't value them. As Charles left the building that evening, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He had seen the signs, heard the voices, but now he had to act. Apex Tech was teetering on the edge of a crisis, and he was the only one who could pull it back from the brink. But to do that, he would need to reveal the truth about the company, about the cuts, and most importantly, about himself. The moment of truth. Charles walked out of the building that night feeling the full weight of his responsibility as Apex Tech's CEO. His employees were about to revolt, pushed to the brink by broken promises, toxic leadership, and a culture that prioritized profits over people. And he was the reason why. As he got into his car, he thought about everything he had seen and heard over the past few weeks. Carl's weary resignation, Terence's subtle but unmistakable rebellion, and Melissa's bold leadership had all revealed the company's cracks. The situation was far more dire than he had anticipated when he first stepped into his janitor disguise. He had set out to discover the truth, and now that he had, the question loomed larger than ever. What was he going to do about it? Charles had always prided himself on being a visionary leader. He had built Apex Tech from the ground up, transforming it from a startup into one of the most successful tech companies in the industry. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of the very people who made that success possible. That night, Charles didn't go home. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the city, his thoughts swirling. The streets were quiet, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, but inside his mind, there was a storm brewing. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain, unsure of his next move. Was he willing to face the consequences of what he had learned? Would he have the courage to dismantle the system he had unknowingly allowed to flourish? Asterisk asterisk. The next morning, Charles arrived at the office early, long before the other employees filtered in. Dressed once again in his janitor's uniform, he made his way to the empty break room, grabbed a mop, and started cleaning the floors. His mind was racing with plans, but the familiar rhythm of the mop gave him a momentary sense of clarity. He was a man on the verge of making a pivotal decision, one that could change everything. Around 7:30 a.m., as he wiped down the tables, Charles heard footsteps approaching. He glanced up and saw Jenny, the receptionist, walking in. She looked tired, her usually bright smile replaced with a weary expression. "Morning, Jenny," Charles said, giving her a small nod. Jenny blinked in surprise. She had gotten used to seeing Charles around, but he usually kept to himself. Today, though, his voice was soft and full of genuine concern. "Morning," she replied, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're in early again." "Yeah," Charles said, leaning on the mop. "Just wanted to get a head start. But you look like you've had a rough week." Jenny laughed lightly, though it was tinged with bitterness. "Rough month, actually. Between the endless emails, the managers snapping at me, and now hearing about the bonus cuts, it's been a lot." Charles paused, setting the mop aside. "What do you mean about the bonus cuts?" Jenny frowned. "You didn't hear. Everyone's talking about it. Apparently, there's going to be an announcement at the quarterly meeting. No bonuses this year for the operations and support teams. Management says they're tightening the belt because of the AI project, but it feels like they're tightening it around our necks." Charles felt a wave of guilt. The bonus cuts had been discussed among senior management, but he hadn't been aware that it had trickled down to the employees like this, especially before any official announcement had been made. The whispers of discontent had turned into a full-fledged rumor mill, fueling the unrest he had seen. "I'm sorry to hear that, Jenny," Charles said quietly. "You deserve better." Jenny looked at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Thanks, Charles. It's hard to feel like we matter sometimes, you know." Charles nodded. He did know. Over the past few weeks, he had felt it in every conversation, every interaction. The company's culture had become so focused on growth and innovation that it had forgotten its people. As Jenny left to start her day, Charles stood there for a moment, staring at the empty room. The time for observation was over. It was time for action. Asterisk asterisk. The quarterly meeting arrived faster than Charles expected. The atmosphere in the office that day was thick with tension as employees whispered about what might be announced. The operations and support teams were bracing for bad news, and even some of the engineers, who were usually insulated from the company's financial fluctuations, seemed on edge. Charles, now back in his CEO persona, walked into the sleek conference room, feeling the eyes of his executive team on him. Jessica, Marcus, and a few other senior leaders were already seated, their expressions a mix of anticipation and nervousness. "Charles," Marcus greeted him with a curt nod. "Everything's set for the announcement." Charles took a deep breath. He had been thinking about this moment for days, and he knew what he had to do. "Not exactly, Marcus," he replied, his voice firm. "There's been a change of plans." The room fell silent. Jessica exchanged a glance with Marcus, and the tension in the air thickened. "What do you mean?" Jessica asked cautiously. Charles sat down at the head of the table, folding his hands in front of him. "I spent the last few weeks undercover, posing as a janitor in this company." The room erupted in gasps and murmurs of disbelief. Marcus leaned forward, looking both shocked and confused. "What are you talking about, Charles? Undercover?" "I've been working alongside the janitorial staff, the support teams, and the operations department," Charles continued, his voice steady. "I wanted to see for myself what the culture in this company has become, and what I discovered was deeply troubling." Jessica frowned. "Troubling? What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Charles said, locking eyes with her, that we've lost sight of what made this company great in the first place. We've become so focused on growth, innovation, and profits that we've forgotten about the people who actually make this company run. The people who are overworked, underappreciated, and in many cases, disillusioned. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but Charles cut him off. I know about the bonus cuts, the lack of promotions, and the toxic work environment. I've seen the exhaustion in our employees' faces. I've heard the frustration in their voices, and I've watched them rally together, planning a work slowdown because they can't take it anymore. The room went deathly silent. They're not wrong, Charles continued. We've pushed them too hard. We've asked them to give more and more without giving anything back. And now we're about to take away their bonuses, the one thing that shows them we value their hard work. Jessica and Marcus exchanged uneasy glances. Charles, Marcus began carefully. We've had to make some tough decisions. The AI project. I don't care about the AI project right now, Charles said, his voice rising with frustration. What I care about is this company and the people who make it what it is. We're not going to cut their bonuses. In fact, we're going to reinstate the promotions that were frozen, and we're going to start rebuilding this company's culture from the ground up. Jessica looked stunned. That's a massive change, Charles. The board. I'll deal with the board, Charles interrupted. But we're not going to keep running this company like we have been. We need to put our people first, or we won't have a company left to run. Marcus sat back in his chair, looking at Charles with a mixture of disbelief and respect. You're serious about this? I've never been more serious in my life, Charles replied. He rose from his seat and looked around the room at his leadership team. This isn't just about saving Apex Tech from a revolt. It's about doing the right thing. We owe it to our employees to create a workplace where they feel valued and respected. And if we can't do that, then we don't deserve their loyalty. There was a long, heavy silence as the weight of Charles' words settled over the room. Finally, Jessica spoke up, her voice soft but resolute. You're right, Charles. We've lost our way. We need to fix this. One by one, the other executives nodded in agreement. Charles took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his chest begin to ease. He had taken the first step toward fixing the damage that had been done. But he knew the real work was just beginning. Asterisk, asterisk. The next day, Charles stood in front of the entire company at the quarterly meeting. The tension in the room was palpable, and he could feel the eyes of hundreds of employees on him, waiting for what he would say. He took a deep breath and began. I want to start by apologizing, Charles said, his voice strong and clear. Over the past few weeks, I've had the opportunity to see this company from a different perspective. I went undercover as a janitor, working alongside many of you, and what I learned has changed me. There was a ripple of shock that passed through the crowd. I saw firsthand how hard you work, how much you sacrifice, and how little you are recognized for it. I've seen the toxic culture that has taken root in this company, and I take full responsibility for it. But I want you to know that things are going to change. He paused, letting his words sink in. Effective immediately, we are reinstating the bonuses for the operations and support teams. The rebirth of Apex Tech. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Charles announced the reinstatement of the bonuses. Eyes widened in disbelief. Some employees exchanged glances, their skepticism palpable. Was this just another corporate promise that would fizzle out in a few weeks, or was it the beginning of real change? Charles stood at the podium, feeling the weight of every gaze, every emotion swirling in the room. The skeptical looks were understandable. Words meant little in a place where trust had been eroded over the years. But this time, Charles was determined to prove that this wasn't just about optics or a shallow gesture of goodwill. This was about saving his company from a slow but inevitable collapse from within. Before I continue, Charles said, scanning the room, I want you all to know that these changes won't be easy. They won't happen overnight. But I promise you, from this moment forward, every decision made will be centered on making Apex Tech a company that values its people as much as it values innovation. He took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of his next words. We're not just reinstating bonuses. We're overhauling our leadership structure. The management team that has been part of the problem will undergo mandatory leadership training to rediscover what it means to lead with empathy. And those who don't align with our new values will have to make tough decisions about their future with Apex Tech. Charles let the words hang in the air for a moment, allowing the employees to process the scope of the changes. It wasn't just about financial rewards anymore. This was about reshaping the very core of the company's culture. Starting today, he continued, we are implementing a new system of open communication between all levels of the company. We'll be introducing anonymous feedback channels, regular one-on-one meetings between management and staff, and employee-led town halls where your voices will be heard, not just once a quarter, but regularly. He looked out at the sea of faces. Some were still guarded, but he saw sparks of hope in the eyes of many. They were listening. We will also be creating new pathways for promotion that are based on merit, not favoritism. For too long, deserving individuals have been overlooked. That ends now. Charles saw Melissa in the crowd, her arms crossed, watching him closely. She had been one of the most vocal during his undercover stint, and now she represented everything he wanted to nurture in the company. He gave her a subtle nod of acknowledgement before continuing. And finally, he said, his voice growing stronger, I want you to know that I've been in your shoes. Over the last few weeks, I walked your halls as a janitor. I heard your frustrations, your fears, and your hopes. I've seen the incredible dedication and resilience that you all bring to this company every day, and I want to thank you for it. Without you, Apex Tech would not be where it is today. It's time we start treating you like the backbone of this company, because that's exactly what you are. The room was still. It felt as though the air itself was waiting, suspended in the moment. Charles saw Terence, standing near the back, nodding slowly. Carl, who had been so worn down and disillusioned during their conversation, stood a little straighter. Even some of the more skeptical employees seemed to relax, just slightly. But it wasn't just about what was happening in the room. Charles knew that this meeting was merely the beginning. He would be judged not by his words today, but by his actions in the days, weeks, and months that followed. Now, Charles said, closing the meeting, I invite each of you to hold me accountable. This isn't just about me standing up here and making promises. This is about all of us. We're in this together. And if you feel that we're slipping back into old habits, I want you to tell me. My door will always be open. From this point forward, Apex Tech belongs to all of us. With that, he stepped away from the podium. There was a moment of hesitation, as if the crowd was unsure of how to respond. Then, slowly, someone in the back began to clap. The applause grew, spreading across the room, building momentum until it became a thunderous ovation. Charles stood there, absorbing the moment, knowing that this was just the first step of a long journey. The real work was yet to come, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. Asterisk, asterisk. Over the next few weeks, the changes Charles had announced began to take shape. True to his word, the company's leadership underwent intensive workshops on empathy, collaboration, and how to foster a healthier work environment. Old management practices were dismantled, and the employees who had been promoted unfairly were reassessed. Promotions were re-examined, and some of the most deserving employees, like Melissa, were moved into leadership positions where they could inspire others. The bonus reinstatement was the first tangible shift. When employees saw the extra deposit in their accounts, the mood in the office lightened almost overnight. It wasn't just about the money, though. It was a signal, a recognition that their hard work had value, and that their company was willing to invest in them. More profound than the financial rewards, though, was the cultural shift. The new feedback system allowed employees to voice their concerns without fear of retribution. The first few town halls were tense, with employees hesitant to speak up. But once the initial unease wore off, the floodgates opened. People who had been silent for years began to voice their ideas, their concerns, and their solutions. Charles attended every session, often sitting in the back, listening intently and taking notes. He wasn't there as the CEO. He was there as a team member, learning alongside them. Carl, who had seemed defeated when Charles first met him, became one of the most vocal participants. His ideas for streamlining the operations department were not only implemented, but also significantly improved the company's efficiency. Terrence, once on the verge of leading a slowdown, found himself leading a project that revitalized the company's community outreach efforts, helping to repair Apex Tech's public image and boost employee morale. Perhaps the most significant change was in the relationships between employees and management. The walls that had divided the two groups began to crumble as Charles and his leadership team made a conscious effort to build trust. Managers, who had once been seen as distant overseers, started participating in daily operations, working alongside their teams, and understanding their challenges firsthand. Jessica, who had been resistant at first, became one of the strongest advocates for the new culture. She admitted during one of the town halls that she had lost sight of what really mattered in the hustle to meet quarterly goals, but now she was committed to ensuring that the company's success was built on a foundation of trust and collaboration. As for Charles, his role evolved in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was no longer just the visionary CEO guiding the company's future. He was now deeply embedded in the day-to-day experiences of his employees. He held regular listening lunches, where a small group of employees from different departments would sit with him and discuss their challenges and ideas. He continued to walk the halls, not as a janitor, but as a CEO who was genuinely interested in his people. But the true measure of success came when, months after the changes had been implemented, Charles noticed something remarkable. The smile on Jenny's face had returned. The spark in Carl's eyes was back. The energy in the office was no longer one of quiet resignation, but of enthusiasm and hope. Asterisk. One day, as Charles was leaving the office late in the evening, he ran into Melissa by the elevator. She was now the head of her department, thriving in her new leadership role. "You really did it," Melissa said, giving him a smile. "I didn't think you would, but you proved me wrong." Charles smiled back. "I didn't do it alone. This company is stronger because of people like you." Melissa nodded, her expression softening. "Still, it wouldn't have happened without you listening, without you actually caring enough to make a change." Charles paused, the weight of her words sinking in. "I realized that leadership isn't just about making the tough calls. It's about listening to the people who make those calls possible, and I had stopped doing that." They stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, the hum of the elevator filling the space. "So, what's next?" Melissa asked as the doors opened. Charles stepped inside, glancing back at her. "Next, we keep building this company together. And this time, we make sure no one gets left behind." With that, the doors closed, and Charles headed home, knowing that this wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new chapter for Apex Tech, one that was built on trust, respect, and the shared belief that people, not profits, were the heart of the company.